Today, we're going to look at 3 stories that sound totally made up, but they are all actually true. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're over the Like Button's house, sneak into their closet and replace all of their shoe insoles with pudding skins. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of December 21st, 1980, a woman in her 40s walked into a jail cell in Los Angeles, California. Now, in this jail cell already was another inmate. Her name was Etta Louise Smith. She was 32 years old, and at the time, she was laying on one of the benches inside of this cell. Etta had actually been in jail for 4 days leading up to this moment. The police were sure Etta had something to do with the savage murder of a nurse in the area, but they really didn't understand what role she had played. In fact, virtually everything about Etta was very confusing to police. And Etta herself was not really doing herself any favors because she wasn't really explaining how she had the information that she had. Now, Etta had already gone through a 10-hour-long interrogation, which led police nowhere. She had undergone a polygraph test, which didn't lead to any new answers. And she had also undergone a thorough strip search. She had been kept without food for 24 hours at one point. She had been left in this cold jail cell without shoes for 4 days. But she just wouldn't crack. She would not confess to playing a role in this murder. And so this was why police on this day had decided to go another route to get information out of Etta. That woman in her 40s who had just walked into Etta's jail cell was pretending to be an inmate, but in reality, she was an undercover cop. And her job was to go into this jail cell, befriend Etta, win her trust, and see if maybe then Etta would begin revealing information about what she had done. And so after this undercover cop walked into the jail cell, the jailer shut the door behind them, closing in the undercover cop and Etta. And at this point, Etta was woken up by the noise and she sat up on her bench and she looked over at the undercover cop. And the cop, she was immediately struck by Etta's appearance. Etta did not look like a murderer. She was this little, slight, totally unthreatening person who really just looked like a suburban mom who maybe had a white-collar job. But the undercover cop also knew that appearing to be totally harmless was a great cover for being a murderer, and so this could all totally be an act. And also, to this undercover cop, it just seemed like Etta was way too calm and collected given her circumstances. She is effectively wanted for murder, and the police are putting so much pressure on her to get her to speak about it, and she's just laying down sleeping in her cell, making no big deal about it. But the undercover cop maintained a very neutral persona, and she sat down, and at some point she asked Etta, hey, what are you in here for? And Etta, she kind of just looked down and smiled for a second, and then when she looked back up at the undercover cop, she said, you're never going to believe me. The undercover cop at this said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? Tell me what's going on here. Why are you in here? And it was at this point that Etta would say something that nearly caused the cop to break character. Because Etta, she would say, well, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a movie. Now, the undercover police officer tried to be as neutral as possible as she's hearing this, but in her mind, she's like, okay, well, I clearly just discovered Etta's motive for being involved in this murder. Etta wants to be famous. She wants this made into a movie where she's the star. At the same time this conversation was happening, in an office within the jailhouse, a police captain was listening in on the conversation between Etta and this undercover cop. And when he listened to Etta talk about wanting to turn her story into a movie, he just shook his head in disgust because Etta had just brought police to the location of the body of 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a local nurse who was robbed and savagely beaten to death and then dumped in a canyon behind a bush. And now here Etta was talking about how she could get publicity around this terrible, horrible crime. It just did not sit right with the captain. And so as the captain was sitting there kind of watching this conversation transpire between the undercover cop and Etta, the captain was beginning to form a theory of what actually happened to Melanie Uribe and how Etta played a role in her murder. His theory went like this. 6 days earlier, the victim, Melanie Uribe, had left for her shift at the hospital in Burbank, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, but she had never arrived for her shift. And so when her colleagues had noticed her absence, eventually the police were called and a search was launched to find her. But after 48 hours, the police had not found Melanie and there were no signs as to what happened to her. She had just vanished. And it was at that point, 2 days after Melanie had gone missing, that Etta just showed up at the police station and said she knew where Melanie was. And so the detective who was talking to Etta at the time when she came in and said this, he brought out a map and he said, okay, point to where she is. And Etta had immediately pointed to this area on the map called Lopez Canyon, which was about 25 miles away from Los Angeles. And she would tell the detective that, yeah, Melanie is somewhere right in there. When the detective asked Etta, how do you know this? Etta would say she just knew. And then when the detective followed up and said, Etta, this is pretty incriminating that you're telling me you know where someone's body is. What's motivating you to come and say this to me? And Etta would say that her conscience was weighing on her terribly and she just had to go to police. Now, the detective who talked to Etta when she first came into the police station really didn't know what to make of Etta because she looked so unthreatening, and what she was saying, she was saying with a lot of confidence, and it seemed like she was really eager to help the investigation versus just clearing her conscience, which is kind of what she said she was doing. And when the detective looked into who Etta was, he discovered that she had a great job. She worked at an aerospace company in Burbank, California, and she even had governmental clearance. And so this woman clearly has been vetted by the government and by high-level companies, and she's passed the tests. But at the same time, the detective knew there was no good reason for why Etta would have this information, the location of a dead body. I mean, either she's just wrong and there is no body there, or if the body's there, the most likely scenario is that Etta was involved in killing this person or disposing of their body, or maybe both. So the detective said to Etta, hey, come back tomorrow and we'll take a police helicopter, we'll fly out over that canyon, and we'll see if we can find Melanie's body together. And so Etta said, okay, sounds good. She turned and she left. But then just an hour later, Etta came back into the police station with her 2 young kids in the car, and she would tell that detective that she actually just drove out with her kids to that canyon and had found Melanie's body. In fact, she told the detective that her 7-year-old child, who was in the car right now, had been the one to actually find Melanie's body. The detective could not believe this woman, 1, had gone out by herself to do this, but 2, had brought along her kids as well? Like, what's going on with this person? But regardless of how weird this was, the detective immediately rounded up some backup, and with Etta's help, they went out to a particular spot in this canyon, and sure enough, when they got out there, right in the spot where Etta said it would be, was Melanie's badly beaten body. And so it was at this point that the police captain had grabbed Etta and said, you're under arrest. I'm putting you in a cell because there's no way you could have known about this unless you were somehow involved. The captain thought by putting Etta in jail for a couple of days, she'd get scared and start talking. But 4 days had gone by and Etta had not cracked. She had not given up anything beyond telling the undercover police officer that she thought her story that was kind of still developing would likely be turned into a movie. And so the captain really didn't know what to do because at this point, Etta had not actually committed a crime. It was not a crime to find a dead person's body and report it to the police. And there was no evidence that actually tied Etta to the murder. All the police had was the fact that Etta came to them and told them that she knew where the body was, and then they actually found the body. But that's all they had. But the police captain would catch a break on that 4th day because he would receive a phone call that would totally change everything about this case. It would turn out on December 17th, 1983, so the same day that Etta would go into the police station to report that she knew where Melanie Uribe's body was, well, on that day, Etta was at work listening to the radio and filing some paperwork. And as Etta listened to the radio, the local newscaster was talking about Melanie Uribe and how she was missing. And the newscaster talked about how police had found her truck and it was parked on this dead-end street, and that police were searching nearby residences to see if maybe they knew what happened to Melanie. But as of right now, there really was no new leads. They did not know where Melanie was. And it was right around this point that Etta's listening to the news about Melanie that Etta heard a voice in the room she was in. And the voice said very clearly to Etta, she's not in one of those houses. And Etta immediately, when she heard it, she turned around wondering who the heck was in here, who's talking to her, but there was nobody else in the room. And then it was like immediately there were these flashes of images in Etta's brain that she had no idea what they meant, but it was a succession of a dirt road and then a bush and then something white, a nurse's shoe. And Etta very clearly saw these three images. And it was right then that Etta thought, oh my God, I know where Melanie Uribe is. And so she sat there wondering what to do, and then finally thought, I have to go to police, as crazy as this sounds. And so she hopped in the car and she drove to the police station and she said, I don't know how, but I do know Melanie Uribe is right there in that canyon. But when the police had said, come back tomorrow and we'll go out and look for her, Etta just couldn't wait, and so she had gone with her kids, driven out to the canyon that she had seen in her mind, and sure enough, when she got out there, she found the dirt road that she had seen, then she found the bush that she had seen, and then with the help of her kids, they found the white nurse's shoe, and it was right near Melanie's body. Which meant that voice that Etta heard and the vision she had all been real. The phone call that the police captain received on the fourth day that Etta was sitting in jail and talking to the undercover cop, the phone call that changed the whole case, well, the phone call was from another police officer saying they had just arrested 3 men who were caught bragging about beating and killing Melanie Uribe, and they had confessed and they were now being held in jail. And so clearly, Etta did not commit this murder, and so even though it made no sense that she just knew where this body was, the police had to release Etta the same day, so she was released, and then ultimately the 3 men who confessed to killing Melanie Uribe, they would be found guilty, and they would each be sentenced to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta would sue the police department, and she would win the lawsuit because the jury on that case absolutely believed that Etta really did have a psychic vision that led to the discovery of Melanie's body. Etta would never go on to make a movie about her story, and in fact, when she was asked later on about why she said that during her conversations with that undercover cop, Etta would clarify that she didn't say that she wanted to make a movie, but rather she said to the undercover cop something to the effect of, it feels like I'm living out a bad movie. And so that was kind of misconstrued by police into her saying, I want to make a movie about this. She didn't and has never made a movie and in no way has sought out any fame or recognition for what happened. Today's video was sponsored by SoFi. Shortly after I left the military in 2017, my family and I decided we wanted to move. And so we went house hunting and found the one we wanted and moved to purchase it. Now, we had bought one other house before, but we used what's called the VA loan, which is a low interest loan for military members. And for a variety of reasons, we were not able to use the VA loan to buy this new house. And so we had to go the traditional financing route. And my goodness, was going through that process totally overwhelming and stressful. But if I had known about SoFi at the time I was doing this, the whole thing would have been a breeze. SoFi is the ultimate finance app that helps you bank, borrow, and invest all in one place. But what really stands out to me about SoFi are their incredible home mortgage loan options for military veterans. SoFi is actually a veteran-led company, which is definitely part of the reason why they care so much about supporting military veterans and active duty military members on their journey towards realizing their financial ambitions, which includes home ownership. Veterans who use SoFi can qualify for perks like lower interest rates, lower closing costs, no mortgage insurance, and also potentially no down payment requirement. So think about joining the over 130,000 homeowners who SoFi has helped get their home loans. Also, SoFi is doing a giveaway where you can have a chance to win up to $50,000 that will go towards helping a veteran pay their rent or mortgage for 1 year. To enter, click the link in the description below or go to sofi.com/winva and then just follow all the on-screen instructions to view your VA home loan mortgage rate. Thank you, SoFi. Back to the stories. On the night of November 7th, 1860, a 51-year-old American politician walked inside of his modest 2-story home in Springfield, Illinois. This politician was totally exhausted, but he was also really happy because in his hand he had a telegram that confirmed he had won an election that he had worked so hard for and he wasn't sure he was going to get. And so earlier that night, this politician had been out basically partying and celebrating this huge victory, but now he was totally beat and ready for bed. Once the politician was inside his house, he picked up an oil lamp to light the way, and he walked through his house to his study, where he put the lamp down on his desk. He put the telegram saying he had won this election next to the lamp, and then the politician just collapsed into his sofa to fall asleep. But before he closed his eyes, this politician looked over at a mirror on the wall, and what he saw in the mirror made him gasp, and he sat upright and looked at it like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. In this mirror, this politician was seeing his own face, reflected as it should be, but then next to it was another face, and it was not his. It kind of looked like him, but it actually looked more like a corpse, like a dead person was looking out at him from this mirror. And so the politician, he stood up and began walking over to the mirror to get a closer look, but as he got closer, the dead person's face disappeared, and all was left was his own reflection. And so he's like, okay, I must have been dreaming that, that can't have been real. And so feeling very unsettled, this politician just went back over to the couch and he laid back down thinking, okay, just forget about that, go to sleep. But again, he glanced over at the mirror, and now that he was laying down again, he saw the two faces again, his own and this dead person's face. And at this point, he stood up and rushed out of the room into his bedroom where his wife was. Now, his wife was a very devoted spiritualist, and so the politician thought maybe he could tell her about what he saw in the mirror, and she could interpret it and tell him what it meant. And so he sat down and he told his wife about what he had just seen, and she would sit there for a minute pondering what her husband had just said, and then her expression on her face just totally changed. She went from intrigued to very upset, and in a quivering voice, she would tell her husband that what this meant was he would serve honorably in the office that he had just been elected to for one term, he would get reelected, but he would not survive the second term. Now, when the politician heard this, he immediately rejected it. And he said to his wife, there's no way that's true. I probably didn't even see a face in the mirror. I'm probably just so tired, I imagined what I saw. So let's just forget about it. But his wife was not consoled, and she fell into his arms sobbing as if he had just been diagnosed with some fatal illness. And over the next several days and weeks and months, this politician's wife continued to be so upset about this potential death omen that the politician had apparently had, even though, again, the politician is constantly telling his wife, come on, there's no way that's actually going to happen. And sure enough, over time, the politician's wife did sort of stop being so scared all the time that her husband was going to die, and the politician himself, he just kind of forgot about what he had seen in the mirror that night. And so he would go on to serve his first term in this elected office. He would be reelected for a second term. And then during his second term, on April 14th, 1865, this politician and his wife were out at a play in Washington, D.C., and during the last act of the play, a man named John Wilkes Booth famously snuck up behind Abraham Lincoln, who was this elected politician. He was the president of the United States in his second term. And John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, killing him. And so Abraham Lincoln would indeed not survive his second term, just like the mirror death omen had predicted. On April 1st, 1984, a 28-year-old man named James Sevigny opened his eyes and looked down and saw his whole body was covered in snow, and a lot of that snow had turned red from what looked like blood. James tried to take a breath in, but as soon as he did, his chest exploded in pain. Then James began moving his tongue around in his mouth, and he realized there was this weird substance in his mouth, and there were all these sharp objects in his mouth. And so when he spit, he realized what it was. It was blood and shattered teeth. James began to panic and tried to lift up one of his arms, but it wouldn't move. And then when he tried to move his other arm, it did move, but that little movement hurt so bad he began crying in pain. So James is dealing with this blinding full body pain that he has no idea what it came from. He's looking around and he can barely understand where he is or what happened. But then James looked up kind of right behind him and he saw this enormous snow-covered mountain. Now, James had no idea what mountain this was, but in his head, he thought, I must have attempted to climb that mountain. James was a self-described climbing bum, which really just meant he lived out of his car most of the time and traveled all around the world, seeking out the most dangerous mountains in the world for him to climb. And so as James was racking his brain, trying to remember what happened, suddenly it all just came flooding back. He remembered he was here in the Canadian Rockies with his best friend, Richard Whitmore, and the two of them had attempted to climb this particular mountain. It was an 11,000 foot tall mountain called Mount Deltaform. And James remembered that as they were making their way up this mountain, they were hit by an avalanche. Now, James didn't really remember what happened once the avalanche hit them, but it would turn out he had fallen, along with his friend Richard, about 140 stories as this avalanche carried them down the mountain. For reference, that's taller than the Empire State Building, so this is a massive fall. And so as James is remembering that avalanche, he began looking around frantically for his friend Richard, hoping that maybe he was okay and nearby, and they could work together to get out of this situation. And sure enough, at some point, James looked over and he saw there was a crumpled figure kind of lying in the snow that obviously was another person. And so James instinctively tried to sit up to go over to his friend, but as soon as he attempted to do that, he felt the blinding pain in his body. I mean, he is totally wrecked here, and he couldn't stand up. But James really wanted to go see his friend, so he kind of rolled over, and through the pain, using his one good arm, he crawled his way over to Richard. And for a second, he thought maybe his friend was alive, that he too had survived this epic fall. But as he looked down at Richard, he could see his chest was not moving, and his neck was twisted really badly, and so was his back. And so James knew his friend Richard was dead. And so James just collapsed into the snow, feeling unbelievable anguish and sadness and fear. I mean, this is the only other person out here. They are nowhere near civilization, and it's going to be at least 4 days before anybody even notices that they aren't back yet, because that was when James and Richard were supposed to be home. And now James is thinking, like, I can't even stand up. I can barely breathe. I'm so badly hurt. What am I going to do? And pretty quickly, James adopted the mindset of, unfortunately, you're going to die here. And this was something James had always thought would happen to him eventually, that a mountain would end up killing him. And here he was realizing that, yep, that's exactly what's about to happen. I'm going to die out here. And so James just kind of lay there, resigned to his fate, literally waiting to die. And after about 20 minutes, when his body began to go numb and he was starting to enter into hypothermia, James heard a voice from behind him. It was this woman who walked right up to him, and she said, "You can't give up. You have to try." And James, even though he was totally caught off guard that there was another person out here, there was something so calming about this woman and the way she was talking to him that without any hesitation, it was like James's whole mindset about this situation completely changed. Suddenly, he was not ready to give up and die. But now, because of this woman, he was going to fight to survive. And so, after kind of moving around and looking back towards this woman, she would say to him, "Put your coat on." And so James, despite the excruciating pain, used his one arm that still worked and kind of propped himself up. And then he pulled his coat out of his pack, which was lying near him. And very painfully, he slipped this coat over his broken and damaged arms. And then once the coat was on him, the woman said to James, "Now take a sip of water." And so James, without any hesitation, he reached over and grabbed this water. He unscrewed the top and took a sip, despite how painful it was to sip, even though the water stung his totally shattered mouth. And then after James put the water down, the woman very calmly told him, "Okay, now disconnect yourself from Richard's body and then use the tree right here to pull yourself up." And so he untied from Richard, and then using his one good arm, he grabbed the tree and he managed to hoist himself up onto his totally destroyed legs. And he couldn't believe he was even standing at this point, but here he was, up on his feet. And then the woman said, "Okay, it's time to move." And so James began walking away from the mountain, and this woman just followed along behind him. And for a long time, he trudged through this knee-high snow, barely able to take a step without this blinding pain coursing through his body. But every time he began to stumble or slow down or seemed like he was going to give up, the woman would very calmly urge him to keep going, keep moving. And finally, after about 4 hours of this horribly painful trek James was on, he came upon the camp that he and his friend Richard had built before coming over to this mountain to begin this climb. And so James quickly began moving towards his tent that was still pitched, that he knew inside had a warm sleeping bag and some water and food. And so as he made his way towards the tent, he stopped himself and he turned around to talk to his guide, to thank her for pushing him onward. But when he turned, there was no one there. And when he looked at the ground, there was only one set of bloody footprints that were his, leading all the way back to where he had fallen. This guide, this woman, she didn't exist. James was totally unsettled by this and really didn't know what to do about it, but he knew right now the priority was just to survive. And so he made his way over to his tent and he attempted to get inside of it, but his hands were so cold and so badly beaten up that he couldn't use the zipper. He couldn't even get it open. And then finally, when he managed to use a tool to get it open, he couldn't open up his sleeping bag. It was like his body was shutting down. And so we thought, okay, I'll make a fire and that will be enough to keep me warm. But again, it's like his body was failing him and he couldn't do it. He couldn't start the fire. And so right as James is realizing that, despite making it to this campsite, he may not be able to survive because he can't use the campsite, he began to hear voices. Right away, James is worried that the voices he's hearing don't really exist, like this woman he had seen. But sure enough, just a second later, 3 skiers came around the corner and they saw James. And amazingly, one of them was a very experienced mountain guide and another one of them was a nurse. And so right away, when they saw James, they saw he was dying. The nurse rushed over, she made a fire for him, she got him comfortable, she put on warm clothes, and the mountain guide, he took off to go get help. And sure enough, a couple hours later, a helicopter arrived and they airlifted James out and he would make a full recovery. However, it would take James years before he finally opened up about this mysterious vanishing woman who literally saved his life. Without her talking to him and urging him to go, he would have laid there next to his friend and died. But James, he was afraid to bring up that he had seen this woman in fear that people would think he was crazy. But when he finally brought it up, he would quickly learn that he was far from the first person to experience this phenomenon of having this invisible person help you. In fact, this phenomenon is common enough that it has its own name. It's called the third man effect. The third man refers to this mysterious vanishing person that steps in and helps people survive who have just undergone some horribly traumatic event. An example of somebody else who has experienced the third man effect was the very last person to escape the Second World Trade Center tower on September 11th, 2001 in New York City during the terrorist attacks. He was able to get out right before it collapsed because a mysterious vanishing voice told him exactly which direction to go until he escaped. And so, whether the third man effect is actually supernatural or just a trick of survivor psychology, we don't know. James, who is both an atheist and a scientist, says he does not believe that this woman who saved him was an angel or connected to religion in any way. Instead, he just said, it was a presence that I needed at the time that saved my life, but that is the extent of my understanding. There are many totally terrifying stories that have come from Native American folklore, but none are quite as unsettling as the story of the Wendigo. According to the Ojibwe people, the Wendigo is this huge 12-foot tall, slightly emaciated, gray-looking humanoid creature that's constantly roaming the earth searching for food because it's always hungry. And what does it eat? People. The Wendigo will be featured on the very first episode of our brand new incredible podcast from MrBallen Studios called Run Fool. Run Fool comes directly from the mind of the horror storytelling icon Rodney Barnes. Rodney is an award-winning writer and producer who has helped define the horror genre in film, TV, and even in comic books. And now I'm certain he's going to help redefine the horror genre in podcasting. To hear the story of the Wendigo, go run to wherever you get your podcasts, look up Run Fool, and make sure you karate chop that follow button. Episodes 1 and 2 of Run Fool are available right now wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, every week, Rodney will drop a brand new scary story. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, which has hundreds more stories just like these available to listen to right now, but many of those stories are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. In the early morning hours on a Saturday in 2013, a man dressed all in black hid in the shadows on a side street in downtown Antwerp, Belgium. The man had lost track of how long he'd been there, but he didn't care. He'd hide in the shadows for as long as he had to, waiting patiently for the perfect moment that he knew was gonna arrive eventually. And then finally, stumbling footsteps approached, and the man crouched down and got ready. But before we get into that story, you may have noticed that today is a Wednesday, and you may be asking yourself, why am I getting a new story on a Wednesday? Well, beginning this week, you're gonna get 2, 3, even 4 new MrBallen videos each week right here. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we do upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and lay hundreds of mousetraps inside of their bed. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. After midnight on Saturday, October 19th, 2013, a 23-year-old man named Ode Egilus stood at the bar in a packed dance club in Antwerp, Belgium. The bartender slid 2 shot glasses across the bar towards Ode, and he grabbed both of them, he held one, and he handed the other to his friend, Kevin Rodriguez Fuentes, who was standing right behind him. It was Kevin's birthday. So Ode raised his shot glass and shouted happy birthday in Spanish over the pounding dance music, and then the 2 young men slammed back their drinks. Ode had moved to Antwerp, Belgium from Spain about 6 months earlier when he had gotten a job as a computer engineer. When he'd arrived, he hadn't known anybody. But he'd met Kevin at a beer festival, and the 2 of them had gotten along right away. And Kevin was from the area, so he'd introduced Ode to a bunch of his friends and shown him the best spots to hang out in the city, and the 2 had gotten very close very quickly. Now, standing at the bar after, taking their shots, Kevin tapped on Ode's shoulder, and he pointed out at the dance floor, and he grinned, because there was a group of young women about their age all dancing together out there. And so the 2 young men, they headed out to the dance floor to go speak with these girls. And from this point on, the night really became a blur for Ode, who kept going back and forth from the dance floor back to the bar for more drinks. But, despite that, Ode was having a great time. It was really nights like this that made him feel like Antwerp was his new home. But he also knew if he stayed out much longer here, he might end up passing out right on the dance floor. So Ode and Kevin and some friends they had just met on the dance floor stumbled out of the club and into the city. When they got out there, the streets were pretty empty. And so Ode reflexively pulled his phone out of his pocket and looked at the time. Now, his vision was fuzzy, but even still, one-eyeing it, he could see that it was close to 4 a.m. And given the fact that it was so late, basically it was the next day at this point, he just told the group good night, and then he turned around to start walking home to go to bed. The next morning, Ode's friend, Kevin, woke up with a pounding headache. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around, and he let out a sigh of relief, because he was safely in his bedroom in his apartment in Antwerp. He had been so drunk by the end of his birthday celebration the night before that he literally didn't remember getting home. And so now, painfully, he rolled over and grabbed his phone off the nightstand and reflexively texted Ode, along with another friend that had been out with him the night before, asking how they were feeling. The other friend texted right back, but Ode did not respond. But this didn't really worry Kevin that much. I mean, he's horribly hungover. Ode has to be as well, and so he likely is just sleeping it off, and he'll be in touch when he wakes up. However, all day that day, Kevin did not hear from Ode. And then the next day, October 20th, when still Kevin has not heard from Ode, he really started to get worried. But when Kevin called Ode to check on him to make sure he was okay, when he put the phone to his ear, it didn't ring. Instead, it went straight to Ode's voicemail, like his phone was turned off. And to Kevin, this was pretty unusual. Ode was usually very responsive, even with a hangover. And by this point, Kevin had given him a full day, 24 hours to recover, he should be in touch by now. What's going on? So Kevin called the other friend who they'd gone out with, who had texted him back the day before, to see if maybe Ode had checked in with him. But that friend said he also had not spoken to Ode. And so at this point, Kevin hung up and just decided to go to Ode's house and literally physically check on him. However, when Kevin arrived at Ode's house, he found Ode's roommates, but no Ode. Ode's roommates did not know Ode very well, so they didn't know what was sort of normal and not normal behavior. So when he had gone out for Kevin's birthday party and didn't come back, they just figured he was crashing at a friend's place or something. But to Kevin, this was unusual. To hear that he had not come back, that was not normal. He would know if, Ode was at a friend's house. And so Kevin was starting to panic. But then Kevin remembered one of his and Ode's mutual friends
had recently gone out of town for a wedding. And so Kevin thought, maybe that's where O'Day is. He's gone with her to the wedding, and that's why he's not here, and that's why he's not answering his phone. So Kevin left O'Day's house and called this friend, a young woman whose name was Oyane. He was hoping that she would have an explanation for everything, but instead, when she answered the phone, it was obvious from her voice that she was also freaking out about O'Day. Oyane said she also had been calling O'Day nonstop over the past day or so, and she couldn't get in touch with him. And so it was becoming clear that nobody had seen O'Day since the night of the birthday party when he set off around 4 a.m. to walk home drunk from the bar. Kevin had no idea what he was supposed to do, but he felt like his friend was in trouble. So he contacted the police and officially reported O'Day missing. The following day, Monday, October 21st, Kevin sat in a small room across from members of the missing persons unit of the Belgian National Police. And as soon as the officers started asking Kevin questions, it became clear that this was going to be a very frustrating meeting for everybody. Because no matter how hard Kevin tried, he literally couldn't remember much at all. His memory of his and O'Day's night out on his birthday were really just blurry images and pieces of random conversations because, he was drunk. But Kevin did manage to remember what O'Day had been wearing. He had a gray hooded sweatshirt and a black and white checkered scarf. And he also knew the area of town specifically where they had gone out. But really that was it. And so by the time Kevin left the police station, he felt like he was really letting his friend down. And he just couldn't handle the idea that now he would just have to sit around and wait and hope police magically found him, when right now O'Day, wherever he was, could be in trouble or hurt or something. He just felt like he had to do something. So that afternoon, Kevin met up with some of O'Day's other friends, and together, they began hanging posters all around the city that had pictures of O'Day on them. Antwerp was a very busy city, filled with bars and restaurants that stayed open very late, so they were sure that somebody had to have seen O'Day while he was walking home. He couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. People don't do that. Meanwhile, detectives in the missing persons unit got to work. Now, Kevin had not given them a ton to go on, but knowing where in the city he and O'Day had gone out and what O'Day had been wearing did actually turn out to be quite helpful, because with this basic information, police were able to collect CCTV surveillance camera footage from outside of the bars, restaurants, and street corners where Kevin and O'Day had been. And it didn't take them long to pick up on O'Day's trail. The investigators were hoping to find footage of O'Day getting into a cab or some other vehicle, or maybe wandering into a building, or even evidence that he'd been attacked in some capacity. And at first, they thought that is exactly what they'd found, because on camera footage around 4 a.m. on the morning O'Day disappeared, the police saw him wandering down this dimly lit side street on his own. His black and white checkered scarf really jumped out on the footage, and the police watched on video as this man suddenly came out of the shadows and rushed O'Day. The man attacked O'Day and stole what looked like O'Day's wallet right out of his pocket, and then the man took off running. And as disturbing as it was, the footage did not actually surprise the investigators very much. While Antwerp was not a particularly violent place, it was a big city, and drunk people wandering home at night did occasionally get mugged. However, what the investigators saw next on the surveillance footage did completely shock them, because after the mugging, O'Day had pulled himself together and kept heading down the street. And on footage taken a few minutes later from a different camera, the police saw O'Day still wandering on his own when suddenly 2 new men rushed up, attacked O'Day, took his phone, and then they ran away. Meaning, in the span of just a few minutes, O'Day had been mugged twice by 3 different people. And none of the investigators had ever seen anything like that. It was like something you'd expect to see in a movie or a TV show about a guy cursed with bad luck or something. But as bizarre as this was, investigators now had something to go on. They didn't know if these muggers, the 3 men, were connected in some way, or if this had truly been 2 random, unconnected muggings. But O'Day's cell phone and wallet had been stolen by these guys. So they could track O'Day's cell phone data and also his credit card info, and the investigators hoped that would then lead them right to O'Day's attackers, and they could figure out what their affiliation was and why they targeted O'Day, and hopefully where O'Day is now. The investigators' plan took a few days, but it did pay off in a big way. By tracking O'Day's credit card, investigators discovered that somebody had attempted to use one of his cards at an ATM in the city. And so they pulled surveillance footage from that ATM to identify the first mugger. Then, by using cell phone tower data and CCTV footage along the route where they saw his cell phone was taken, investigators were able to identify the other two attackers involved in the second mugging. And so now they believed they just needed to talk to these thieves to figure out where O'Day was. Fast forward to October 29th, 10 days after O'Day's disappearance, and he still is nowhere to be found. Officers from the Missing Persons Unit interviewed these three muggers separately. The police made it clear that they had a pile of evidence here that showed they mugged O'Day shortly before he vanished, so there's no point in trying to deny it. They know what they did. And none of the muggers did try to deny it. In fact, all three men admitted that they had jumped O'Day on the street, and they told the police exactly what they had stolen. But they insisted their attacks, the two muggings, were not coordinated at all. They just happened to have gotten to O'Day within a few minutes of each other. And then even more importantly, they also all insisted that they had nothing to do with O'Day's disappearance. All they did was rob him, that's it. As the investigators listened to these muggers talk, all they could do was stare in disbelief. The idea that three muggers had randomly committed two attacks on the same man within minutes of each other, and that their victim had then disappeared in yet another unrelated incident, seemed almost comical. But no matter how hard the police pressed these guys, they all completely stuck to their stories, which was, we mugged him, and then we ran away and we never saw him again. The police arrested and held all three men in connection to the robberies that they admitted to doing. But their goal, despite what these men have said, was to find enough evidence to still charge them with the kidnapping, or maybe even murder, of O'Day. But then, a new piece of surveillance footage surfaced from a new camera. And this new footage actually showed O'Day moments after the second mugging. And on this footage, investigators didn't see any of the muggers dragging O'Day away or something. Instead, just like the muggers said, they really did take off after that second mugging. And just like he'd done after the first attack, O'Day dusted himself off and just kept on walking down the street and out of the camera's range, but he was alone. And so now, to their complete astonishment, the police had to admit that the muggers might be telling the truth, and that O'Day could have just kept wandering the streets of Antwerp for hours after he'd gotten attacked. They didn't know, but they know the muggers ran away and O'Day was alone, at least briefly after the second attack. And also, this new footage made them realize that to really conduct this investigation, they were going to need to search the entire city to see if anyone, anywhere, had seen O'Day. So, in early November of 2013, about 2 weeks after O'Day's disappearance, Belgium National Police conducted a massive investigation throughout all of Antwerp. They visited all the bars, all the restaurants, all the clubs in the area roughly where O'Day and his friends had been out partying. But no matter who they spoke to, no matter where they went, nobody knew where O'Day was or what happened to him. But as they hit all these dead ends, the investigators' search continued, and it sort of slowly migrated north through Antwerp in the rough direction where O'Day had been last seen walking, away from the city center and towards the banks of the River Scheldt, which runs right through Antwerp on its way to the North Sea. On the evening of November 7th, so by this point it is 19 days since O'Day was last seen, several detectives from the Missing Persons Unit stepped onto the deck of a very unique structure that literally floated on the River Scheldt. The structure was called the Bod Boat. That morning, police boats had been dragging the river itself and were searching the riverbanks with dogs, looking for any signs of O'Day. But the search of this river couldn't be completed without a stop at the Bod Boat. So the Bod Boat was basically a massive club, bar, and high-end restaurant that had been built into a converted ship that was moored right in the middle of the stretch of the river that police were dragging. But the biggest attraction of the Bod Boat was not the food or the dancing. It was the almost Olympic-sized swimming pool that had been built into the deck of the ship, and it looked like it was floating right on top of the river. People referred to it as the world's largest floating swimming pool, and it was always packed. The bod boat had a very good, very wide, unobstructed view of the city and the river. And so the detectives were hopeful that if O'Day had passed by, someone on the bod boat likely would have been able to see him. So now the detectives split up and began interviewing the bod boat staff and the patrons, asking if any of them remembered seeing a young man in a distinctive black and white checkered scarf on the morning he went missing. Now, at this point, pretty much everybody in the city had already heard of O'Day. I mean, his face was plastered on posters everywhere, and people really wanted to help. But as detectives talked to everybody at the bod boat and the pool and the bar and the restaurant, everybody, as much as people wanted to help and thought they might have tips that could help, nobody had anything that was meaningful. And so eventually, the investigators had to leave the bod boat, and they just spent the rest of the afternoon on the banks of the river watching the marine unit do its work. But just like on the bod boat, there was nothing found in the river itself. On November 19th, 2013, so now 1 full month after O'Day's disappearance, friends and family gathered publicly, both in Antwerp and his hometown in the Basque country of Spain. In Spain, his family made it clear that they still hoped O'Day would be alive, and that this gathering was not a memorial. It was instead to show their love for O'Day and to bring continued attention to his story so he could be found. In Antwerp, O'Day's friends tried to convey the same message with their meetup, that O'Day had to be out there somewhere and he might be okay. We just need to keep looking. However, by the end of 2013, so now over 2 months after O'Day's disappearance, it became clear that the police investigation was really not making much headway at all. Police still had those 3 muggers in custody in hopes that maybe they would crack and they would admit that they had done something to O'Day after the muggings. But the 3 men had not changed their stories at all. And also, after over a month of canvassing the entire city, no new evidence had really surfaced at all. And so O'Day's friends and family really began to worry that the police might just abandon the search because there was nothing they could do. But then, starting in the early summer of 2014, so a little more than 7 months after O'Day first disappeared, something incredible happened. O'Day's story went viral, and not just in Belgium or in his native Spain, but all across Europe. And this really is not how things typically played out. Thousands of people go missing in Europe every year, and most of those cases go relatively unnoticed by the media and the general public. It just is what it is. But the story of this young man who had moved to Antwerp to start his career and a new life, only to vanish without a trace after being mugged twice in the middle of the night, it just seemed so unbelievable and also resonated with people everywhere. It just felt so tragic. And so as the police, who by this point really had throttled back their search quite a bit, I mean, it's been 7 months by now, as police were showing signs of just basically dropping the case, people all across the continent demanded the police not just continue, but increase their scrutiny. Look everywhere, triple your efforts, find O'Day. And so there's all this unbelievable international outpouring of support from this viral story. I mean, you had poets all over the world writing poems about O'Day, and you had musicians writing music about O'Day. You had charity groups coming out in Belgium and doing their own search for O'Day. I mean, it's like the whole world was rallying to get the Belgian government to act. Like, triple your efforts, find O'Day, he's out there. And then what sort of pushed it over the edge was in October of 2014, as the first anniversary of O'Day's disappearance approached, one of the most famous soccer players in the world, Cristiano Ronaldo, played a game with images of O'Day on his jersey. I mean, his story really had reached basically everyone. And it was at this point that Belgium did act. The Belgium National Police literally doubled down on their efforts to search the entire country for O'Day. They're not just looking in Antwerp anymore, they're going to look everywhere. They also enlisted the help of Interpol, an international police organization, to expand the search to other European countries. And so throughout 2014 and into 2015, investigators in Antwerp revisited bars, restaurants they had gone to during their initial canvass, and they re-interviewed people connected to O'Day. They also made public announcements to let people know they were still looking for O'Day. But despite all this effort, despite really doing their absolute best to find O'Day, they couldn't find him. But then on September 18th, 2015, so 1 year and 11 months after O'Day's disappearance, something happened with the bod boat that changed everything. So to understand what happened, you need to take into account the literal design of the bod boat. So the bod boat really was, this entertainment hub that had been installed in this decommissioned boat. But the boat is not like a boat that we think of when we think of a huge ship or something where there's multiple stories and a huge deep keel that goes beneath the surface of the water. Instead, it was more like a big floating dock, almost like a catamaran-style boat, where it's sort of one level, this big rectangular square, and there really is nothing below the surface. It's more like a big floating dock. That was the bod boat. And on September 18th, 2015, the swimming pool on the bod boat began to leak. Now, remember, you're looking out at the bod boat from land, and it basically looks like a big floating dock with all these attractions on it, including a pool. And so even though you'd see the surface of the swimming pool being at level with everything else, basically right at the top of the river, well, there's a recessed portion that effectively touches down into the river. And so at some point, there's a leak that formed on the base of this pool, and the pool began taking on all this extra water, and the pool literally broke off from the bod boat structure, and it sank to the bottom of the river. Now, luckily, no one had gotten hurt when this happened, but the story had taken over the news. The bod boat was a huge attraction for people in Antwerp, as well as for tourists visiting the city, and so the city immediately began working to come up with a plan to resurface the swimming pool and rebuild the bod boat. Finally, on February 11th, 2016, so almost 2.5 years after O'Day's disappearance and 5 months after the swimming pool sunk, 2 cranes attached to a boat were brought in to latch onto the base of this pool at the bottom of the river and try to resurface it. And on that afternoon, a member of the work crew stood on the boat, watching the water and helping oversee everything as the cranes slowly did their work. And as he kept his eyes trained on the water, eventually, the bod boat's swimming pool, which was still actually mostly intact, broke the surface. And as this happened, a few of the workers let out a cheer, but something in the water caught the crew member's attention. At first, he couldn't tell what it was, but when he leaned down to get a better look, he immediately shouted for the crane operator to stop. The cranes fell silent, and with shaking hands, the crew member took out his phone and called the police. Eventually, once they put all the evidence together, this is what police believe happened to O'Day on the early morning of October 19th, 2013. At around 4 a.m., after leaving his friends, O'Day began his walk home. And like the police already knew, he was mugged twice in a matter of minutes. But after the second mugging, he really did pick himself up and sort of collect himself, and very likely he was hurt, he was scared, and he was very drunk, so likely disoriented, doesn't know if there are more threats coming, doesn't really understand what's even happening, but he needs to get home. And we know he continued trying to walk home for some time, because eventually he came in contact with a group of strangers who would eventually come forward and confirm this. But they apparently saw this guy who looked beat up and disoriented. It was O'Day, and they called out to him and tried to convince him to let them book him a cab to get him home. But he was so disoriented and so drunk, he didn't even answer them, and he just walked off. But at that point, he had moved fairly far north in the city, and he was getting near the banks of the River Scheldt. So for reference, he had walked pretty far off course. He was not near his home. He was clearly lost. And at some point in his disoriented, scared, drunken state, he tripped and actually fell into the river. Now, the shock of landing in the water likely, potentially sobered him up a little bit, but he was really, really drunk. And so even if he had tried to swim and get to shore, there was a strong enough current that it would have been fairly difficult to get out of the water. And so the current ended up pulling him all the way up against the side of the bod boat. And so once he was there, kind of pinned against the side of the bod boat, right on the side of the bod boat where that swimming pool was, he was too weak and drunk to swim out of the current. And so he just kind of being pressed up against the wall of the side of the bod boat until he had no more energy left to fight. And he was slowly pulled under the surface and forced underneath the bod boat, specifically to the bottom of the recess of the swimming pool, where there's not much space between the bottom of the pool and the bottom of the river. And so he basically got pulled down and got wedged right in that space underneath the pool of the bod boat. And there he drowned. And for more than 2 years after his death, O'Day's body remained wedged underneath that swimming pool. And so for all that time, people are swimming in the pool, not realizing they're a couple feet away from a dead body. But then finally, the swimming pool, sunk to the bottom. It was pulled back up by those cranes, and attached to it at this point was O'Day's body. And that was how they found him. The muggers who attacked O'Day were ultimately convicted of robbery, and they all served approximately 4 years in prison. Now, the muggers were never actually shown to have any direct connection to O'Day's death. And while authorities believe the most likely scenario is that O'Day simply fell into the water, they were never able to officially rule out foul play. O'Day's parents have called for further investigation. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On July 4th, 2018, a paramedic was hurrying through a hospital in England when a supervisor flagged him down looking very concerned. She asked him if he had been one of the paramedics on a very specific call a few days earlier. Surprised, the paramedic said yes. The call had been completely typical, so he didn't really understand why this particular call mattered so much. But the instant he confirmed he had been there, his supervisor said she would explain in a minute, but for right now, he had to take off all of his gear, like all of it, right now, because there was a chance that what he was wearing could kill him. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right show, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and remove all of their outlets and then replace it with a blank plate. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 29, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. So they'd been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. So Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years. And so she had a hard time finding work. And for the last 2 years, she had actually lived in a therapeutic group home. But it was a little after she had moved in there that she had very fortunately met Charlie. Now, on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin. He also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just going to pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy. And so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments and visiting the park and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated. And she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she'd really wanted Charlie to come with her, since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie and really was excited for her life with him, at the current moment as they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs, And being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get-together with her family. And now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad, not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concerns to Charlie, he did go and, wash out the dye from his face, and he got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt just so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with her family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room, listening to Charlie and their friend Sam Hobson talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she had gone to her place, and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left, and then she'd called her mom. Dawn actually had 3 kids of her own, and 2 of them were adults. But her own mother, so Dawn's mother, had custody of the youngest child. And Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at this get-together. And her mother had said yes, so Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom, and just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and just sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street or even in dumpsters and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around. So the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. Then minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:30 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank a ton the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and he sat on the couch next to her and said good morning. And between Dawn not feeling that great physically and remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he'd gotten a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen, and then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts, but, they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money. And so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. And she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this. And she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten this? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug, and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out and she sprayed some on her wrists and she rubbed them together and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag now in her lap, and she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom, and then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much, to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and then off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now, and so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend Sam to shoot up some more heroin, because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door, and as soon as he opened it, he gasped, because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and he laid her on the floor, and he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp. And in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover. This is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on, that, Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic. But they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited, and so they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn, so he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived. And by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio. And sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics streamed inside. And at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful, like more medical support meant that Dawn was going to be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that Dawn didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, their voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing. Dawn's heart had apparently stopped. Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he just watched in panic and despair as they loaded his girlfriend on a stretcher, and then he followed them out of the apartment to stay with Dawn for as long as he could. And then before they put her into the ambulance, he leaned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by the commotion. They'd had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. But Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that. Because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here, and he sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down. This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean, and this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent and being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different outing to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go say a prayer for Dawn. Now, they were back at his place to pack up a bag both for himself and also for Dawn that they would bring to her at the hospital, and then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would kind of, clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here, and he went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it got faster and faster, like he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and he goes into the living room and he just sits down on the couch, feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs, because I always do drugs, and this is not it. I've never felt this way. And he looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me! Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" And he began backing away. And Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was going to attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth. And then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up. And then the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He'd clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever. He had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly, to the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. But the doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. And the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user. And the apartment where they'd both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by a life support machine, and Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs. It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was, poison in the drugs they took perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 3rd, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she'd taken some prescription psychiatric medication. And so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs. So he was waiting on those results. But admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him his answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point, they believed that, maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment, because some of the symptoms you get with the gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together that morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. And so presumably they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment, and then he feels sick. It didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak, you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus, you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So, all told, the gas leak theory seemed to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to this strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England, so Dr. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning. It matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, then they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they'd issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and to everybody else involved with the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and fast. The next morning, July 4th, so 4 days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had one of the nurses send them to one of these hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Dawn's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and once they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it. But now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case here. Then he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needed their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter the next day at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that, Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Jukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better, and she was doing better. She didn't want much. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life, and that's the path she was on. And so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not. But as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful. But he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her, and he hadn't gotten that. None of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes, he looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs. But they did show something else. Something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was. Like literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Dawn and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital. Literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger. And it might already be too late. And so Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office. He picked up the phone and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits, and they were swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Dawn and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the UK's Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie now wear protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Dawn and Charlie and made them bag up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Dawn or Charlie. And others were contacting Dawn and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now to close it off and start taking more samples. He also had another team at Dawn's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so at this point, all Murphy, or anybody else for that matter, could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic. But specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened. And now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, with Dawn now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one, and that was Charlie's apartment. And so Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits, so they moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor and open bags of fabric and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and some hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during their response. And other areas of the place were littered with medical debris, like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsills. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to, identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from an overdose. But soon it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. An investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, a kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results, it was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper. That was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it belonged in this space, was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison, unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrists in excitement,